Okay, good evening. I am Julia Wrigley, the interim provost of the Graduate Center. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. At the Graduate Center, we like to say that our public programs put you at the center of the conversation. That is certainly true of our programs this spring, which put you in the middle of the most timely issues, from immigration to inequality to biodiversity. Our programs feature wonderful writers, including poet and novelist Julia Alvarez and Frederick Douglass biographer David Blight, the renowned physicist Freeman Dyson, and the extraordinary panel that joins us here tonight. At the center of tonight's conversation is the free press, certainly one of the most critical issues of our time. It is at the heart of democracy and of the Graduate Center's new project called The Promise and Perils of Democracy. Over 2 years, as we study and talk about and probe democracy, we aim to ignite research, encourage collaboration among scholars and students, and engage in timely and thoughtful public discussions like this one. We would like to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting the Promise and Perils of Democracy project, and we are happy that their President Vartan Gregorian and his colleagues are joining us tonight. Throughout this initiative, we ask 3 crucial questions. The first is, what is democracy? And that is our theme for this semester. Second, what are the threats to democracy? And third, what's the vision for democracy in the future? This semester, we focus on several principles of democracy, including a free press and the role of the judiciary. This country's founders believed freedom of the press was so fundamental to their new democracy that they put it up front in the First Amendment to the Constitution. To get to the center of the conversation about the role of the free press in democracy, how we protect that freedom, and what it means when that freedom is challenged, we turn to an exceptional group of award-winning journalists. Their writing manifests deep context along with wide global perspective, and they have a lot to tell us from their experience as working journalists and as keen analysts of the free press today. As it turns out, when you have speakers who are working journalists, 2 of the panelists who plan to be here tonight, Bill Moyers and Jelani Cobb, are not able to join us. But we have the good fortune to welcome 2 other outstanding panelists. To begin, Anne Applebaum is a columnist for the Washington Post, where she focuses on national politics and foreign policy, and she's also a historian with expertise in the history of communist and post-communist Europe. She is professor of practice at the London School of Economics, where she runs ARENA, a research project on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. She is the author of several books, including Gulag, A History, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. She lectures all over the world. Michelle Goldberg joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in 2017, and the following year was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for public service reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues. Many of you will also recognize her as a frequent contributor to MSNBC and other radio and TV broadcasts. She has reported from all over the world and is the author of 3 books: Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, and The Goddess Pose, The Audacious Life of Indira Devi, the woman who helped bring yoga to the West. It's quite a range. Jeff Jarvis, next panelist, is the Leonard Tao Professor of Journalism Innovation and Director of the Tao Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at CUNY's Craig Newmark School of Journalism. He is an expert in the development of online news, blogging, the investigation of new business models for news, and the teaching of entrepreneurial journalism. His media blog, buzzmachine.com, focuses on current issues, including threats to a free press here and abroad. He is the author of a number of books, including this one with the wonderful title, Geeks Bearing Gifts, Imagining New Futures for News. Our next panelist, Professor Graciela Mochkofsky, directs the bilingual Spanish language journalism program at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism at CUNY. She has reported for publications throughout Latin America, Europe, and the United States. She is the author of 6 books, 2 of which look at the relationship between the press and political power in her home country of Argentina. Professor Mochkofsky is the winner of the 2018 Maria Moore's Cabot Prize for outstanding reporting across Latin America and the Caribbean. And last but not least, tonight's moderator is Peter Beinart. He joins all of our speakers tonight in wearing a multitude of hats. He is Associate Professor of Journalism at CUNY's Craig Newmark School of Journalism and Associate Professor of Political Science here at the Graduate Center. He is also a very active journalist. He is a contributing editor to The Atlantic, senior columnist for The Forward, and a CNN political commentator. He is a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and has been a frequent guest on television broadcasts. Please join with me in welcoming our esteemed guests. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. We're very lucky to be joined by a group of people who can talk and range both about the particular challenges to freedom of the press inside the United States and also to put that conversation in a larger global perspective. So we'd start the conversation a little bit by the specific challenges that we face in the Trump era here in the United States and then broaden it out to some of the comparative questions of other countries and the particular challenges that they face and how those may be similar or different. So Michelle, maybe I'll start with you. Just to start really broadly and kind of crudely, how dangerous is the threat to freedom of the press in the Trump era? How much more trouble are we as journalists, as people who believe in a free press, in today than we were on those days that day when Donald Trump kind of took that gold-plated escalator down the stairs at Trump Tower?
So I feel like as individual journalists, are we in, kind of personal danger? A little bit. Like, are we in existential danger as a country and an industry? Much more so. So the people I think who are in the most immediate, real physical danger are foreign correspondents, both American and otherwise, right? I mean, when Jamal Khashoggi was killed and, Washington, American resident, Washington Post journalist, and the administration basically shrugged its shoulders, it sent a message, to kind of autocrats all over the world, like, do what you will to people. And I've been told, and I think there's a general feeling in the industry from, kind of communications between people at the top of the elite press and people in the government that, in the past, if you were a foreign correspondent, you had some degree of protection. If you were an American foreign correspondent, you kind of knew that your government was going to be there if you were abducted or mistreated, and that's really gone. I think that nobody thinks that, Donald Trump is going to care if, say, you're abducted covering, the war in Yemen or, Syria. There's just not a sense of that there's any sort of solidarity between this government and its citizen journalists. So that's, I think, the most extreme danger. There is the danger of incitement. I think that, it's hard, I don't want to over-dramatize it, right? I mean, I get a lot of death threats. I've changed nothing about the way I live. A lot of my friends and colleagues were either targets of mail bombs by Cesar Sayoc, that sort of Florida man, van dweller who wanted to bomb Donald Trump's enemies. There was more recently a member of someone in the Coast Guard who was arrested with this massive terrorist plot, and he had some of my colleagues at MSNBC he had planned to kill, but I don't know how far it went. I actually think that eventually something is going to happen, but so far it hasn't, and I don't think American journalists are walking around, feeling physically intimidated the way journalists in many parts of the world are. And then finally, there's just like the, not so much intimidation, but just we've never before had a government both that engages in, kind of demonization of individual journalists, that has basically a state TV propaganda network that engages in like deliberate falsehoods, and just a lack of transparency that is unlike anything we've ever seen before. So everything from the fact that the White House visitor logs are not accessible in the way they used to be, to an ignoring of FOIA requests, or just the fact that the administration doesn't have press conferences anymore, or at least doesn't have regular press briefings anymore. And so, all of these things, we've gotten to this stage where on the one hand, it feels, I don't think people are running around with their hair on fire, even though 2 years ago, if you had described this state of affairs to people, it might have seemed like something close to a worst case scenario.
Jeff, I wanted to ask you, the Trump administration's, let's just say, different perspective on the press has come at a time when the press itself is challenged in many ways. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that is, about the intersection between an administration that shows hostility to the press and a press that's grappling with its own challenges of trying to find sustainable kind of business models.
It is a case of kicking us while we're down, though of course the Trump paradox is that we got the Trump bump, which I think lasted for about 2 years. I think Mark Thompson at the Times recently said that is kind of over in terms of circulation. So there was a temporary push for that, and our enrollment at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism as well, which I think was a factor. But I think those are temporary. The longer existential threats we have, or clearly we have a major business threat. More than that, we have a threat to trust. And I want to be careful here, as we talk often about restoring trust in mainstream media. There are many communities that did not feel they were ever represented by or that they trusted mainstream media. So we've had issues we've got to deal with there. And then we have obviously then the larger question of the so-called flight from truth. And I don't believe we're in a post-truth era, but we are in an era of diminished respect for the truth. And I think that we make the mistake too often of believing that just getting more facts and just fact-checking more facts will somehow solve things. And I'm coming to think that the country needs less fact-checkers and more mass psychology. Kellyanne Conway, believe me, I hate to say this, was right when she talked about alternative facts, because what you have now, in the words of Dana Boyd, who's a brilliant researcher at Data and Society here in New York, she talks about warring epistemologies. If I hate you, I hate your facts. And so that's the kind of atmosphere that we're in now. So in that atmosphere, to do journalism and to tell uncomfortable truths, at the same time, just to preserve the value that we had in society, at the same time we're being forced, and I think probably in the long run to the better, to reinvent journalism, to rethink what it is fundamentally. So it does come at a point where it's a kick to the kidneys when we can least afford it.
And how much does it, obviously one of the most high-profile way that, that's interesting, there we go, the Trump administration sabotage.
It's the Russians.
Okay.
It's all the Russians.
Obviously, one of the most high-profile public ways in which people experience the Trump administration and the media is simply that Trump endlessly insults the media, right? He says again and again, this is fake news, these are bad people, they make it all up, it's lies, don't believe any of that. That's not the same as jailing journalists, obviously, but how important and dangerous is simply the fact of the President of the United States essentially telling the public that these journalists are bad people and you shouldn't believe them?
So I would answer that first by saying that I think Trump is the product of some of the things you were just talking about rather than the only cause of them. You know, in a way, if you step back from our current moment and think about it, we are really at a profound moment of a kind of information revolution. The nearest thing that one can find in history is the moment of the invention of the printing press, which was, you know, the radical 15th century technology that made it possible for everybody to read and write and made knowledge spread, but also undermined the authority of the monasteries that had produced all of the literature up until then and led to the Reformation, which is good if you're Protestant and maybe not if you're Catholic, but which then was followed by hundreds of years of European religious wars that were ended only, you know, by the Enlightenment. So
Sound like a happy analogy.
Well, it's an important analogy to think about because we really, what's happened, you know, in the last decade, very, very quickly. I remember the iPhone was invented in 2007. What's happened very, very quickly is we're now in a world where most people get their news on their phones. On a telephone screen or even on a laptop, there is no visible difference between the New York Times and a far-right white supremacist screed. There aren't distinctions made anymore between these different kinds of media. We're in a world where the very profound polarization that we're now living through actually began some years ago. I mean, you alluded to Fox News. I think Trump is somebody who intuitively understood how some of these systems were already working. In other words, he understood that we're in a profoundly polarized society, which means that, you know, the people in one half not only feel distant from people in the other half, they are actually living in a different world. So we have people who literally think one thing happened yesterday, and people think another thing happened yesterday. And he was one of the first politicians to understand or to believe that if he spoke just to his national politicians, some state politicians already understood that if you speak just to one constituency, that's enough to win an election. And so he's probably the first president we've had in living memory who does not try to be the president of the United States, but is simply the president for the people who live in his news information space. So he understood how polarization worked, and he understood also the disorienting nature of social media, and there's an additional factor, which is the nature of the new media. This is Facebook in particular, but all of the social media websites platforms work to some extent this way, seeks to capture attention and therefore seeks to keep people on their sites by feeding them more of what they want to see. In other words, if you're interested in if you like a particular kind of soap or a pop band, you see more and more information about that. If you like a particular kind of politics, you see more and more information about that. So in other words, the polarization that had begun with the Fox News versus CNN has been deepened by social media, and Trump saw that and took advantage of it. So he's really the product of that. But to your point of him undermining the press, I mean, I think this is now a political game in which he understands that bad information is going to come out about him that he doesn't like, whether it's about his taxes or about his relationships with Russia, his business relationships. And if he can undermine the press and he can make it seem worthless, then he can make it part of this polarized game. In other words, they're on the other side. You don't have to pay attention to them because they belong to the other team. And he's the product of it. He understands it, and he's seeking to make it worse and to do politics on the basis of that.
Graciela, one of the signature Trump issues on which he has helped to deepen the polarization in the United States is the question of immigration and some of the subject of some of his worst demagoguery. And I'm interested in how in what it's like to cover immigration and the border today in this era of Trump. What's it like for the journalists who are doing that?
Yes, so thank you for the question. Before, I wanted to follow up on something that
Yeah,
they just
please.
mentioned, because we used to joke in 2016 when Trump was elected with other Latin American friends that we came from the future. It's a very old joke now, but it is we've seen in other societies outside. Polarization is, to me, the main, one of the keys to explain these processes. And so we saw how presidents who came to power and they chose a particular outlet, a newspaper or a corporation, some of the media, they created a political enemy. In that media outlet became the political enemy in the lack of an actual political opposition or leadership. So instead of doing the traditional political game and having an opposition in a bipartisan country, for example, like the other party, there was a void of leadership, and so outlets became the opposition. And the danger to me, and this is a lesson I think for American journalism, and I know a lot of people are aware of this, is that the outlets accepted that role. And so that what Anne was describing happened. So you had this half of the media that was for the government, the other half of the media was against the government, and you couldn't find the same facts in both, even covering a protest. The number of people who attended was just ridiculously different. So you couldn't get a sense of what really happened. And we come from a very different tradition, from a more European tradition of journalism, where your journalism actually represented an ideology or a political party, or it was not. We didn't have the objective or the illusion of neutrality, and that was not part of the landscape. Here, what we've seen in America traditionally, always, I grew up, I came to university here 20 years ago, and I admired a lot of what the best American journalism. You used to believe, and I think a lot of people still do, and mainstream media still does, in part, that facts, that your job was to get the facts, and if you deliver the facts, people would see the truth in those facts and would come to the right conclusions. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, not from the part of the media. I think a lot of the papers, the Times, the Post, all of them, they still function like that. But I don't think that's the case for the audiences. I think audiences, you see all these studies, and that's why I think you were talking about mass psychology. Audiences don't care about the facts. They don't see through. They just see intent. They see, I don't like your facts because you are too liberal, so I won't believe them. I had a journalist today from the Dallas Morning News. He was interviewing somebody, and the person was saying something that did not match reality, and he said, no, but look, the facts show otherwise. And the source said, sometimes perception is more important than facts. Don't give me your facts. I have my ideas. So that's one of the, I think, to me, is as somebody who studied Latin American media and relationship with power for many years, I find it fascinating to see how you're dealing with that here. To your question on immigration, I think that's one of the areas where we've seen, I think it was last week or the week before, that The Intercept came out with this report, this investigative piece showing how journalists, American and Mexican journalists from both sides of the border, who are covering the border and the Central American migration, the current situation in the border, that there had been a lot of concerns among journalists that they were in some kind of a list and they were being followed. Some people thought that was just paranoid. They were just being paranoid. But now that list has surfaced, and it's true that there has been, both on both sides of the borders, that there is this agreement and joint effort from the Border Patrol and Mexican border police forces, tracking journalists who are, and following them physically and in social media, and collecting information on them. And there's an escalation in the past months, weeks, journalists have been detained, not detained, but detained for a while, hours, interrogated harshly in the border. And that never happened before, and I don't think my American colleagues thought that was ever going to happen to them in their own country. That was something that happened in the third world in other countries. There's another, I was interviewing for a report that we are doing at the Newmark J-School on how has it changed for Latino outlets, Spanish-speaking journalists, and mainstream journalists from mainstream media covering the border and immigration in the past few years. Most of the people covering those areas were there before. They've been covering immigration for a long time. And what I hear is that it's very hard. It's much harder to get official sources. It's much harder to trust the information that they receive from official sources, and that they feel they are in a list. They feel they are followed. They don't know what. There's this uneasiness. There's this worry. They're worried that the situation is changing and that it might become normal.
So I wanted to ask you to respond a little bit to a really important point that Graciela made, which is when the President of the United States defines you as the opposition, right? How then do journalists respond to that, right? I think one of the challenges that a lot of publications have faced is, do they give space to pro-Trump voices, right? We've always had, one could say, in many of the mainstream outlets, a kind of discrepancy between the legitimacy of, let's say, a liberal and a conservative perspective. But now you have a situation where the perspective, the position of essentially being in support of the President of the United States is considered in many circles to be simply a racist perspective, not a perspective that actually one should give legitimacy to. So I'm interested in what you think the right way to respond by journalists is to Trump's demonization, and also to the kind of, if there are, in what moments, if any, it is appropriate to actually give a platform to pro-Trump voices.
So I think one of the real difficulties that a lot of outlets have faced when they've sort of tried to bring in pro-Trump voices is that, well, first of all, you face the issue of sort of what is the so-called center, or what is both sides, right? I mean, you remember when Trump was first elected, and there was a lot of people were right, well, when Trump was first installed, and there was there was a lot of pushback against the idea of normalization, right? That we can't treat this as normal. And treating it as normal would be like, well, there's one side to the debate and there's the other side to the debate, and so a lot of, I think, publications were torn, that on the one hand, this is obviously a significant constituency in the country and you want to understand them, and that launched, a million kind of these, sad safaris to some desiccated steel town where somebody would go to a diner and record all these people's grievances. But then, at the same time, I mean, if you think about who are the writers out there, I don't know if you can think of a writer who is with these three things: pro-Trump, honest, and not racist, right? So there are pro-Trump writers who don't even believe what they say, and something I see there's a difference between somebody who's kind of an ideologue and maybe will twist the fact, and someone who's just purely cynical and who is basically writing press releases and whose views have no value because they don't even believe what they're writing. So there are some of those people. Then there are, say like maybe the closest thing I could think of to a pro-Trump intellectual would be someone like Michael Anton, who wrote the Flight 93 election, about how the 2016 election was like one of the planes that had been hijacked on 9/11, and the only option was to rush the cockpit, even though it was probably going down. That was his rationale for voting for Trump. Then he went to the Trump administration. And his thing is basically we're being overrun by people from kind of white America is being overrun by people from an alien culture. Is that a view that belongs in the major newspapers of the United States? I mean, I would say it doesn't. And so you end up, I don't see any kind of good solution to this, because you end up in this situation where, we sort of elevated a lot of these never Trump conservatives who are interesting to argue with, but we are not really arguing with the people who are, whose ideas kind of have currency in the political debate, in part because you can't really argue with them. I mean, I think part of what happened is that throughout the 90s and the 2000s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, we talked about politics as being a battle of ideas. And there was this idea, there was this kind of conception that even if you were a liberal, you really had to kind of understand a whole body of conservative intellectual work to sort of understand what was happening in American politics, and you had to engage with those ideas. And now I think what's happened is that the people who believe in ideas are a side, and then there's the people who believe in race and power. And so it just doesn't, it's not the kind of thing that gets contested on the editorial pages of newspapers. I think that it's necessary. There's a reporter for the Times who did, I think, a really interesting piece the other day about and I'm not going to try to reprise it because I don't have it all in my head, but talked about the role that race played in this election in Pennsylvania, which to me, the right way to do it is not to do these sort of maudlin portraits of people who are saying, Hillary Clinton called us deplorables, so we decided to do this terrible thing, but is to actually go out into Trump country. When I covered a lot of Trump rallies during the election. I never heard anyone talk about NAFTA. I heard a lot of people talking about Mexicans. And so, go out to those places and be serious and unromantic about what it is, what has driven this movement, kind of what are the grievances and the vision for this country, which is often, I feel like, irreconcilable for the vision of what a decent society that sort of obtains in New York. But I don't think the answer is just to decide that Trump is president, so the ideas that gave us Trumpism, or the semblance of ideas that gave us Trumpism, now have to be treated with respect.
And you've written just really remarkable stuff about Eastern Europe and about the way countries like Poland and Hungary and others have experienced maybe an even more dramatic version of some of the challenges that we're facing in the United States with authoritarian governments and people who have succumbed to the lure of authoritarianism. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little about what you think people in the United States could learn from what's been happening in Europe and in Eastern Europe in particular, and some of the similarities and differences between challenges to freedom of the press here and there.
I mean, there are a lot of parallels actually between what's happening here and what's happening in Europe. You could, whether you call it the revival of nationalism or the revival of some kind of white supremacism or return to some kind of, it's a kind of return to ethnic politics that you see in a lot of countries. There are strange ways. In fact, what we now have it's almost a kind of nationalist international. The nationalists around the world are uniting into an international movement, and yes, that's weird. And there are very funny stories, actually. Very often when they get together, they discover that actually they don't like each other very much. There was a very funny one. There was a very funny article I read about the sort of Austrian nationalists and the Italian nationalists getting together. And there are bits of Italy that used to belong to Austria and vice versa. And one of them said, "Long live Austria" in the South Tyrol. And the Italians kind of fell silent. No, we don't think that's very funny. So, but I think there is, they learn from one another. They play off one another. They're borrowing techniques and ideas from one another. Those who are innovating, whether in their use of social media or in their use of, learning how to use immigration or gay rights as an issue around which to polarize people. People are watching how that works in other countries and copying it. And there are many, many examples of that. I mean, in the piece I think you're referring to, there's I mentioned there's Viktor Orban in Hungary was a kind of pioneer of using immigration as a polarizing issue in a country that has no immigrants. So this is not a country where you could argue there's a real problem or there's sort of real people, some people object to their being there. This is a completely imaginary and invented, story. And then I think. Then we've seen there have been copycats. The Poles tried to do. There was a Polish populist party which tried to do the same. There's a way in which Trump's caravan meme that he used during the last election was very similar. There was discussion of this caravan that's coming, even though we all knew it was never going to get here and it was going to break up before it arrived. And the subject of it was dropped immediately as soon as the election was over. This is the midterm, obviously. And so there are these different groups and people are learning from one another. And I should say one of the things that people abroad are learning from the Trump administration, what authoritarian governments are learning, is this language of fake news, of disqualifying media and so on. I mean, the number of copycat, whether it's the Turks or whether it's the Israelis or whether it's the Poles or almost anybody who dislikes their local media or dislikes what's being reported about them now dismisses this as fake news. You're all phonies. And this language that the Trump administration has used has been, don't underestimate the degree to which the United States has been seen around the world as a kind of model by a lot of other countries. Even when, those governments of ours that not everybody in this room would like, we're still seen as, you might like the Bushes or you might like the Clintons better, but nevertheless, the United States was understood to defend, as you said, we defend our foreign correspondents, we defend the rights of the press around the world. It is now understood also in other countries that this is no longer the case, and people are copying that and imitating it and taking advantage of it. There was just recently, a couple of days ago, a story, a Polish journalist was beaten up in Venezuela trying to cover demonstrations there, and the journalist happened to be a correspondent for a newspaper that's opposed to the current populist government. And of course, the scandal there is that the populist government is in no way interested in the fate of this journalist because he's from the wrong newspaper. So, and 5 years ago, not that long ago, you could imagine you could imagine the U.S. stepping in, or you can't imagine a previous Polish government doing anything like that. And I think this is the influence of Trump around the world.
Right. As I was actually mentioning, I had this experience last summer where I was briefly detained at Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, and one of the things that the person who was kind of interrogating me said, because he mentioned that I had gone to a protest a couple of years earlier, he said, if an Israeli went to the United States and participated in a protest, the U.S. would kick them out right away. And I wanted to say, no, we don't do that in the United States. And then I thought, no, maybe he's actually quite right, that he actually understands that the rules of the game have changed, right, both in the United States and abroad.
It affects the way Americans are treated abroad. It affects the way other people are treating their own journalists. There's a copycat. There's a kind of copycat movement, and of course, our administration is copying what they see in Europe as well.
Right. Graciela, I wanted to ask about Latin America. First of all, what impact, if any, has there been on the changes in the United States on the relationship between governments and the press in Latin America? And also, to pick up on the same question I was asking Anne, since there are places in Latin America that have been grappling with authoritarianism for longer periods of time and its impact on the press, what do you think are some of the lessons that we can take in the U.S.?
So I think, I believe what Anne says, that there's this copycat effect and the language is really crucial. I don't think the autocrats of the world, and then I'll talk about Latin America. I think they already mistreated their journalists badly, and they would still do it, but there is this idea that there was a place where that was not allowed, and now it's like, it's allowed for everyone. And then you have, of course, the president, embrace those autocrats, so that gives them probably more, space to do these things. To me, there's an interesting fact to me that maybe you're not aware of, but the Committee to Protect Journalists, this big organization here in the US who has been monitoring the freedom of the press in the world for a long time, opened for the first time a task force to actually monitor your own freedom of the press. In 2016, because Trump was elected during the election, there was no need, or there wasn't felt as a need from that organization in the past to monitor freedom of expression, freedom of the press in the US. And now they have a very active website, they have a tracker, and the numbers are still, from where I come from, I mean, Argentina has very good numbers, is very safe, but compared to Brazil or to Venezuela or to Central America or to Mexico, the numbers are still very small, but you see a tendency where every year there's been more journalists who have been attacked physically, murdered, 5 murdered journalists last year compared to 0 all the way back to 2007 when there was 1 case. So you see, so now the office that does the Americas for CPJ, that really does the Americas, not just Latin America from Mexico down. We don't have, so we had our dictators, military dictatorships, but those ended most of them in the early 80s or late 80s in the case of Chile. And we actually had a very, and that was my whole career as a journalist. I became a journalist in 1991, and it was great to be a journalist in Argentina and in most of Latin America throughout the 90s, and also in the 2000s. In the 2000s, what we had is not that we didn't have that in our countries. It's not that there was no freedom of the press or that there were autocrats. What changed everything was actually polarization. So when we had these left-wing, in some cases populist governments throughout the region, including my country, what happened is that the press became a political actor, and it became part of it took sides, and so you had, official press and official, very much state control, government control outlets, even if they were private, but they basically received funds from the government, and they basically did propaganda, a bit like Fox News and the ultra-right, or the right, not the ultra-right, does here. And the model, and then everything else was against, and there were verbal attacks that in some countries became, and I have to say all the countries have very different ecosystems. So in some countries like Venezuela, it became on people, attacked and beaten, and in some cases, brought into jail and detained by the government. In some other cases, what happened, especially in Brazil and in Mexico, is that internal forces, like the military officers in the border towns, or town, or the mayor of a town, or narcos in the case of Mexico, and before that, Colombia, understood that journalists were not a protected sector. There was no, the government was not defending the journalists, and the government had made part of the media industry the enemy, so there was a free pass to attack and kill journalists. And that, I think, the most striking case is Mexico. You can see that. At the same time, the ecosystems are very different, and the media ecosystems where this started was very different. There was very little, in most of our countries, very little real independent journalists in the past decade or so, because you had established media that was very much establishment, and so they had their economic interest or political interest. And then now that the situation has been hard in the past 10 years, you actually have a very interesting new independent digital ecosystem of outlets and people who don't have the chance to work for establishment media, so they create their own outlets. And I think social media has played an amazing role in that case, and it's given people a lot of voices, and has allowed journalists who couldn't get a job because they were blacklisted by governments. They can have their own outlets and they can cover the news. And if you look at Venezuela, in those situations, the best journalism, some of the best journalism in the region is by Venezuelan independent journalists who make $100 a year, and they don't have, electricity, and they still somehow, do these investigative pieces and this amazing news coverage.
Jeff, you're something of a social media guru. So this is a big question, but in the Trump era, given the new threats to freedom of the press, in what ways is social media the problem, and in what ways is social media potentially the solution?
I'm an old blogger, started in 2001, and so my instinct, pretty much without fail, is to open the tent broadly into what we call the press, what we call journalism, and what we call speech, and that we stand together to protect speech and the public conversation. And the things that Graciela talked about, one of our graduates from the entrepreneurial program at CUNY runs one of the sites in Venezuela, terribly brave, able to do that only because of the internet. There's a lot of talk in the last few days, obviously, about the horrible events in New Zealand and the video that came out of that. And there are those who say that Facebook should shut down live tomorrow. I was just on MSNBC this morning, yelled at about that. And in full disclosure, as I've raised money for our school from Facebook, I receive no money personally from Facebook. And we are independent of Facebook. End of disclosure. But I also point out that it was because of Facebook Live that Diamond Reynolds could broadcast to the world what was happening to Philando Castile at the hands of the police next to her. And it was a power that we in mainstream media had never given her and never would be able to give her. And that recently there was a columnist who tried to push the journalists should get off Twitter because it's debasing the world. Well, I don't think so. I have good friends on Twitter. And I think that now finally social media has enabled communities and voices that were never represented and never heard in mainstream media to be heard. And the last thing we should do is turn our backs on them and not listen to them. So my tent is very wide. The problem I have with this tent is not social media. The problem I have with this tent is how we in journalism are treating the likes of RT and Russia and Fox News here. I personally believe that Rupert Murdoch is the most malign influence on American and English language democracy around the world. I've watched my own family be brainwashed. I've seen what's happened. But we have this myth of objectivity and of two-sidedness, of balance, that we say, all right, there's MSNBC and CNN, and then there's Fox. And I understand why we do that. At the same time, the European Broadcasters Union and other organizations have RT as members. And we have to deal with this in Hungary, and we have to deal with this in Turkey. And so we in media tend these days to go to Facebook and Google and say, clean up the act, get rid of bad actors. But we in journalism are loath to get rid of our own bad actors.
What exactly does getting rid of them mean? I mean, most the people in these kind of polite New York circles already loathe Fox, don't show up on Fox. So what exactly should they be doing?
I'm not sure. I'll take RT because it's easier, and Anne can speak to it far better than I can, and when it comes to manipulation. And by the way, I recommend quickly, if you're interested in this stuff, 3 reports, and I'm sure you have many more. Data and Society did a great report on American manipulation. The NATO handbook on Russian disinformation warfare I found very informative for the methodologies used, and RAND also has a great report on the Russian disinformation fire hose. So what we see is a similarity of technique. Now, not necessarily the Russians don't run everything yet, but there's a similarity of technique across disinformation. So I've sat in rooms where there are journalists trying to set standards for how journalism is done, and RT is in the room. And I say, and when I complain about this, I'm told, well, we'll outvote them. But if we can't even set standards in the room of people setting standards for journalism, how do we expect Facebook and Google to make decisions? And do we want them to make decisions in that line? So I think that, again, my tent is broad when it comes to hearing the voices of communities never heard, to being able to understand the acts of journalism that can occur. But I think that, well, I'll just say this. We should cover Fox News as a story in media. I've begged often for a feature on MSNBC that should be, we watch Fox News so you don't have to. And we also see what that audience, what that base is seeing and what they're not seeing. We should be treating them as an entity, as a political actor in this country and as a story in media, but we are loath to do that because we don't cover ourselves in that way.
Michelle?
True.
Just one quick example of that. I mean, you saw that when the Democratic National Committee said that we're not going to do primary debates on Fox News, which the idea of doing Democratic primary debates on Fox News is ludicrous. But you saw so much kind of, clucking, and, people were just like appalled that, isn't this just the Democrats kind of delegitimizing Fox News the way Trump delegitimizes CNN, this very kind of facile false equivalence. And there's this, I think I'm a columnist, so I can say what I want, but and not the journalists can't say what they want, but what journalists really want is they really value objectivity. They really, so working the refs really works because most journalists that I know very much fear being seen as biased or being seen as, kind of not being fair-minded in their treatment of the right. And I think, on some level, the right understands that and takes advantage of it. But, again, I think that there are people, a new generation of Democrats, I think, has the correct attitude towards Fox News. One thing people can do is just kind of back them up when they try to isolate and marginalize it.
Andy, do you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, I think there are a couple oddities that are worth thinking about just for a second. In my analogy of this being like the invention of the printing press, as you say, the invention of social media, and as you say, has had fantastic advantages. People can speak who never spoke before, and so on. But it has also created new kinds of problems that we haven't really thought about before. And one of them is that the problem of what do we mean by censorship and what do we mean by press freedom is actually is becoming fundamentally something very different. So we all think of censorship in a kind of George Orwell way, that there's Big Brother who in a government office who's taking your, cutting the column out of the newspaper and putting it into the shredder. What was it, the memory hole he put it in. And we think that's what censorship is. Censorship doesn't look like that anymore. Sometimes censorship looks like a proliferation of voices created to drown out somebody else. So, this is, for example, how Saudi censorship works. There, you can say what you want, but you will then be attacked by 3 million trolls who will undermine you and so on. This is how Russian censorship works. So, for example, when the plane crashed over Ukraine in 2014, the Russian government didn't respond by denying that they had anything to do with it. They responded by putting out literally dozens of theories about why this plane might possibly have crashed, ranging from plausible to implausible to insane, because somebody put lots of dead bodies on a plane and they blew it up over Ukraine. literally insane. But the point was to undermine the idea that we will ever even know the truth. And there was a wonderful, I think Radio Liberty did a little interviews with Vox Pop with people on the street in Moscow saying, what do you think happened in Ukraine? And most people said, not only do we have no idea, we'll never know because it's impossible to find out. And so we're now in a world where you can change something and you can alter, you can suppress information by drowning it. And we haven't really thought through yet what the legal and other implications of that are. We're definitely in a different world. And the fact is that the only people really empowered right now to be thinking about this in a serious way are people who work at the social media platforms, which is wrong. It shouldn't be them thinking about it by themselves. They should be thinking about it together with Congress, together with our elected representatives, and so on. That isn't really happening yet. We haven't taken on the idea as a society yet that we need to think about it. We need to think about regulation. As a final thing, I would say that probably what we're going to have to begin focusing on is not regulating content and this issue of what you take down, because that's not going to be the way that we can. We're going to have to look at the architecture of the internet and the architecture of the platform. So, for example, all right, human beings get free speech. Should bots have free speech? So, a computer program that has been set up to repeat and amplify a story from RT or a story by a white supremacist, does that deserve free speech, a little piece of computer code? And we might decide as a society that it doesn't. do all anonymous people speaking in the public space all deserve to be treated, to have the same amplification that real people have? If they can't prove that they're real, so how do we treat fake accounts the same way as we treat real ones? Also probably not. So when we begin to look at as I say, the architecture, how amplification works, how the search engines work, what gets pushed up, what people see, I think when how do the algorithms work? When we begin to have a public interest component in those things, then we'll be on to beginning to think much more creatively about how we, how we regulate the current media environment.
We're going to go to questions in a sec. Sorry, Graciela, did you want to say something?
I think the only thing that we haven't mentioned is that the other factor here is the lack of credibility of the media and of journalists, and this precedes Trump. There were these striking numbers. The Columbia Journalism Review just released their spring, is this the spring? I always have it wrong. Yes, the spring issue, and they did with Gallup. They did this national poll, and they show that 62, I think it's % of the population of this country think journalists get paid by their sources to publish whatever they publish, and then you see, if you look at the charts and if you look at the data. The lack of credibility is just across the board, across communities. You see it's by age and by community, and Democrats tend to trust the press more than Republicans, but still the numbers, the figures of lack of trust is just.
I hate to say it, but to some extent, not in political journalism, but in consumer journalism, people do get paid. Or the magazine gets paid, maybe not the journalist. There's a lot of things that had begun going wrong with, the sensationalism, the 24-hour news, the need to produce things fast, had changed, this idea that we all have an ideal about what journalism should be. It should be sober and high-minded and objective, but actually a lot of American journalism isn't like that and hasn't been like that for a long time, and that's another part of how, look, Trump himself was the master of manipulating the New York tabloids, and that was part of how he won.
And I think the fundamental thing that has gone wrong because of the internet has been just the evisceration of local news, right? Because first of all, if you get your local newspaper, you probably know journalists, right? When there were kind of, 2 newspaper towns with big staff, so people, journalists you couldn't kind of imagine that they were these, venal, sinister figures kind of clustered on the coasts. And then also, you could just reality test what was in the paper, right? Like, you can kind of see that what's in your local newspaper corresponds to your local reality, and then that gives you a sort of anchor to make sense of the other things that are in the paper, whether they're about national or international news. And, there's a lot of research about that, like, controlling for everything else. When you control for everything else, towns without their own local newspapers were much more likely to vote for Trump than towns that had them, even controlling for, education, income, those sorts of things.
Right. Jeff, last word, and then we'll go to questions.
Going back to Anne, I'm also a Gutenberg geek, and I've taken pilgrimages to Mainz as a result. And I like to say that we're at the year 1475 in Gutenberg years, right? We're very early in this process. And so I think we have a few 30 years wars ahead of us, and peasants' wars, and God knows what else. But I also think that it's vital that we stick to, in this discussion, to a level of principles. Because I think that I talk with a lot of people about regulation in Europe that I think is also going to come back here. And I hear talk of questioning the value of the First Amendment. Do we have too much speech? The question of anonymity. Anonymity can be a cloak for cowards, but it's also a shield for the vulnerable in society. And I think we have to hold the level of principles and benefits and fears at the same time, and not fall into a moral panic, which I see happening in much of media about technology. And remember what we stand for as a nation, and what we stand for as an enlightened society, and have the faith that we may have to go through a 30 years war, but we'll figure it out.
Okay, so we have 2 microphones here, and we have a little bit of time for questions. So please come and ask a question. A question is not a statement. It ends with a question mark. And please try to make it relatively brief. That way, more people will get time to ask.
Can I make a statement
Sorry?
and a question?
Good.
I'm rather disappointed. I'm 40 years a journalist, 30 years a foreign correspondent. My daughter works for the Times in Mexico. We're a family of hacks. I came here and I expected that I would hear a good discussion along the lines of Joe Liebling's own remark about the financial support for journalism. Freedom of the press belongs to the man who owns one, he said. I wonder if a number of you could toss about, in fact, what should be done to reform the business model of journalism so that in fact, it can support people as a profession. Just a note to Ms. Goldberg, I'd like to say that when I was in Afghanistan in 1979, before the Russians came in, I can assure you that I would rather, if anything had happened to me, I wouldn't have depended on the US government. I would have depended more on the Salzburgers. And I can assure you that if my daughter were in trouble in El Salvador, she'd depend more on the Salzburgers.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to take a shot at that? How do we reinvent business models for journalism?
I run a center for entrepreneurial journalism at the Newmark School, so I worry about this all the time, and I failed. We haven't invented it. I think that our old mass media business model, built on volume and attention, is fundamentally corrupting in a model of abundance. And it corrupts everything Anne just said about much of media, that's why, and the same model comes over to Facebook and Google, and the same problems are there. So I don't think we've been honest yet about how bad it is. I'm doing an event that my working title is Scorched Earth, because I think that the ad market is going down. Subscription, not everybody is worth a subscription, I'm sorry. Commerce won't do it, events won't do it, it's going down. We haven't been honest with ourselves. But I do believe we will figure it out. I think we're going to be a radically different structure of media. And as Michelle said, the real crisis is in local journalism. Facebook, this may be a straight line, but Facebook said yesterday that they want to link to more local journalism. They can't find enough. And that says a lot about where we are right now. So there's talk about government support. I worry about that, especially given the government we have. But I think that we have more pain in front of us, and we'll rebuild from the ashes once we see where the bottom is.
Okay, I want to make sure other people get a chance to ask questions. Sir?
Yes, I have a different kind of a question. After 30 years, I'm getting back to the value of early childhood education. So instead of worrying just all about, adults with 40, 50 years of, distorted thinking, blah, 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 if we put our focus on bringing up a generation, like Suzuki said, education should be the #1 priority in every country, and all the most creative, talented people should be the teachers because you're molding and shaping the lives of future human beings. And we've seen what, kids, teenagers have done just the other day with climate change, gun control. So I have a theme like give children a voice so they can be heard. And I was just wondering, seeing this as a societal thing, if you feel like journalism could take a role of activating that because you have a means to do that. And I'm just curious about, how you react to that.
So I guess the question is partly about the role that journalists can play in civic education, but I think also maybe there's something to say about what we're starting to see about the way young people, even younger than millennials, are kind of consuming journalism.
And also the Gospels mean good news. So what about a little good news once in a while?
Michelle?
Well, there was initially, I feel like people sort of blamed millennials for the spread of disinformation on Facebook, and then it became pretty clear, which was probably clear to you if you just think about your own experience, that the people who were spreading a lot of fake news were not kind of people who were digital natives, right? They were, people who were, I don't remember.
White men like me.
Right, exactly. And so, so I suppose that there's hope in that people who kind of just understand the internet more, grew up on it more, will be, hopefully less susceptible to some of this stuff. But I don't know. I don't know that we haven't seen the sort of post-truth society yet, right? We haven't seen a society where people have figured this stuff out enough to, I mean, although I suppose in Europe you have kind of enough social cohesion in some places that people have sort of decided to silo off disinformation or silo off Russian information attacks. You know, my kid's elementary school has a newspaper club, and I think those should be in elementary schools all over the place, because if you sort of understand at a very primal level kind of how news is made, it might make you better able to understand kind of how to consume it.
Right. Also, when you have to deal with the school administration, you get a firsthand taste of authoritarianism in action, which is good practice. Anne?
No, I was just going to say that one of the, obviously one of the ways forward for journalism is for people to begin thinking about it as philanthropy, you know, that it's a public interest, it's something you fund the way you would fund the opera, or that you would fund Save the Children or something like that. And one of the, I have a friend in the Netherlands who's thinking right now a lot about how, you know, could we attach newspapers to universities? And this is kind of related to your point. What if universities or other institutions of higher education also began producing or somehow became involved in newspapers? What if the academic material that they produced became the basis for the news? What if journalists, what if universities owned newspapers? So if you can begin to imagine an ownership structure where newspapers are owned by charities, by academic institutions, by other, and you can imagine this working, for example, at a local level rather well, where you have a local community college and it produces the local newspaper. That maybe there's some way to combine some of these needs and to have you begin thinking about newspapers as a sort of, not as a business anymore at all, but as a public service.
Sir? Yeah. Sir, we want to make sure that, go ahead.
Don't you think we need more facts? Don't you think we need more whistleblowers? Don't you think we need more insiders? Could we create a fund to incentivize and protect whistleblowers and insiders? When Michael Cohen held up that check signed by Trump, that was worth more than him saying he's a racist, no, you're a racist. How do we go about doing that?
Okay, interesting. Who wants to take a shot at that?
So I'm actually not sure if you're legally allowed to do that, right? Like if you're legally allowed to sort of offer someone like a financial incentive to, are you? I mean, it would, and I think that, you know, part of the problem there is that then that would undercut, right? If you know, kind of became a whistleblower because there was, right, for money, it would undercut your credibility. You know, I do think, so part of the problem, I mean, you're right, these whistleblowers, they come forward, right, every once in a while, there'll be this moment when we're all sort of living like, or at least people of kind of my disposition are living, you know, in this kind of fog where people are numb, they're exhausted. And then every once in a while, something will happen like that moment, you know, the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times, or some kind of concrete fact, you know, the facts of child separation will happen, and it's like the fog lifts and people suddenly grasp, you know, how far we've fallen, and there's this flurry of energy, but it subsides because it's not sustainable. And so, you know, you're right that the facts need to come out, and the facts probably will come out. I mean, you know, there's been, you know, sort of a renaissance of investigative journalism. Now you have all of these congressional committees. You know, you have, you know, countless federal and state investigations. But to me, the problem is, does it stick, right? Like, are the facts enough? I mean, I remember thinking when the email chain from the June 9th Trump Tower meeting came out, and you basically had somebody writing to Trump Jr. saying, you know, hey, do you want to do some collusion? And he was like, yeah, that sounds great. That was going to be definitive, right? But just there's a way in which each new fact becomes swallowed up in the miasma. Or just becomes, you know, sort of baked into our assumptions, and then you need a new, even more startling fact to get people's attention.
And the fundamental problem is one of trust. You know, there will be people who say, who simply don't trust the facts. So kind of producing facts is insufficient.
Right. Go ahead.
why is the media so lackadaisical about covering every psychotic thing that Trump says and just repeating it as if it was the truth? Every time he says something, it's repeated. And why don't they say, well, this is obviously not true. It's the rantings of a crazy man who doesn't belong in the White House. I mean, as a Hillary supporter, I am outraged that every time he refers to a good woman like Hillary Clinton as crooked Hillary, it's repeated. Why do you have to repeat that garbage? And why isn't there more people saying, why is this crazy man in the White House? And why is Nancy Pelosi saying he's not worth impeaching? Well, if he's not worth impeaching, he's the most corrupt president we've ever had. And even if he was impeached and not removed from office, impeachment is still a stigma and would prevent him from being reelected as president. Ask Bill Clinton if he liked to be impeached. He wasn't removed from office. And when Trump said, I never colluded with Russia, billions of people heard him around the world asking him to find Hillary's emails, and the next day they hacked the DNC computer. So why are you giving this piece of garbage such a free ride when he has not earned it or deserves it?
I think, I particularly, I think one of the questions that I'm interested in responding to is, you know, like just yesterday, Trump sent out goodness knows how many unhinged, right? And one of the things that, I think one of the things is, even if you say that these tweets are offensive and racist, one of the things it does is it crowds out coverage of other news, right? I mean, there are huge stories happening around the world and in the United States that don't get as much attention as they were because Trump, with his incessant need to always hold center stage, does something, and then basically that becomes story number one, and everything else goes down further down the chain. So how should journalistic institutions respond when Trump does these tweets?
I have a simple idea, which is that the problem is that the old view of journalism is the president speaks, we write about it. What I would like to see one major publication do, we have two of them here, is to just have a standing head that says what he tweeted today. And go ahead and publish it and go ahead and respond to it, but the incessant need to do an entire story about every tweet means that he manipulated us well. And if you look, this is why I'm so amazed at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because some people say that she's like Trump, but she's not at all. She uses, no, in the sense of, she uses Twitter well. That misinterprets it entirely. She uses Twitter to build relationships with people, to hold to policy, to have discussion. And I heard some discussion recently that after the hearings where she did a brilliant job, a hot take on Twitter was that she didn't need the media time so she could do what you were supposed to do in a hearing, because she doesn't need the mainstream media. Mainstream media comes rushing after her, but she does what she needs to do on social media. So mainstream media ignored her candidacy. So, yeah, we're in a bad cycle now where every time he tweets, we do a story which only motivates him to tweet again, and it goes on, and who's going to break that cycle?
And it also isn't a
No,
president
sorry, ma'am. I've got to go to our last. This is going to be our last question, sir.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid my question sort of piggybacks on this last one.
Okay, just
So
make it brief.
It seems to me there's a war going on, and it's Trump versus the media. And on this panel, except for Jeff's comments, I haven't heard how the media is planning to fight the war. And it seems to me you guys got all kinds of excuses, whether it's Facebook or Google, or it's the competition, or, you know, they're going to kill us. I mean, I'd like to know what the good thinking is to win the war. Do you realize you're in a war? Do you realize, as Jeff just said, that you've been co-opted, and you got to fight back? And
All right, so
I don't see
why don't we do this? We're going to give everyone a chance. We'll start with you, Graciela. First of all, do you think that the analogy, hopefully it's just a metaphor, the metaphor of war is actually appropriate? And second of all, what do you see journalists doing or journalistic institutions doing that you think is the right kind of response? And what other kinds of things that you don't see would you like to see more of?
So first, I think you have a really, even with the problems you have here and the media have here, it's still a very big ecosystem, and you can't just say media and include everyone in it. So I think there's still a very good journalism being made, and I'm surprised at the resistance of a lot of editors and journalists and reporters in the face of things getting worse, and especially because they started getting worse before that because of the business situation, etc. I do think that, to me, the most striking thing is that, and the danger is that, it doesn't seem like mainstream media has adapted to the new rules of this presidency, that they still think they're playing the game that they used to play in the past, so they cover the president, as Jeff was saying, as a president talking, because they respect the role of the president.
Are you
I think
addressing
at
my
the same time that the media has, mainstream media mostly, but everywhere I read, the language of this presidency is very often appropriated by the media. So the president says fake news, and people repeat fake news because everybody knows what we mean when we say that, even though we despise the term and it's not real, it's just the news he doesn't like. He says the caravan and the crisis at the border, and everybody knows there is no crisis at the border, but you read the headlines and every paper is talking about the crisis in the border and the Central American caravan. So I think there's a problem with language that has to do with this lack of realization that the rules have changed and that the official language doesn't have the weight maybe that it was given before. To me, that would be, I don't know, that's it.
Great, great. Michelle?
I think that it's certainly true that, there's a sort of like epistemological war in the country, but the media, particularly as a sort of, vague, amorphous institution, is not really capable of like colluding or like getting together and deciding about how they're going to take on the president, right? I mean, the media has taken on the president in as much as it has by revealing what he's done, by revealing, a huge amount about his finances, the workings of his private club, all sorts of things. A lot of the things that we now know about Donald Trump and his corrupt foreign dealings, we know because the media has, ferreted it out and has done this really hard, long, painstaking work. Or, in the case of, for example, BuzzFeed took a lot of risks, kind of legal risks to publish, for example, the Steele dossier and, to fight off the lawsuits. So that's kind of, that is the way that the media can take on this president. It can keep exposing him. It can keep fighting these lawsuits. We're going to get tomorrow, because of a lawsuit, we're going to get the Michael Cohen warrants, so that, we'll sort of find out what they were looking for when they raided his office last year. And then the other thing, so the tweets are a difficult thing, because I think that this time around people did sort of ignore them. Yeah. But that's actually, that's problematic in its own way, right? I mean, the last 36 hours of tweets have been, almost a whole new level of crazy, which is saying a lot, retweeting Pizzagate conspiracy theorists and white nationalists and so there's a way in which we'll just ignore the tweets. Well, we have like a madman sitting in the White House, tweeting out craziness, and his followers are certainly hearing it. It's news, right? I mean, I guess it's just sort of about how do you contextualize it. People need to understand it, especially since most Americans still aren't on Twitter. So a lot of this stuff is happening sort of, out of their view. The other way that I think that it's imperative for people to put pressure on media, and particularly broadcast networks, is, one of the biggest gifts that was given to Trump was the live televising of his rallies, right? I mean, and they would just do it because it was cheap, it was, high ratings, he would say something crazy, so people were sort of rapt, and he just got hours and hours and hours and hours of free airtime. And, I think it's going to be really important for people to, ask their networks, ask television stations not to do that. And also be very clear that, if you're going to televise a Trump rally, you should be televising the rallies that all these Democratic candidates are having as well.
Great. Anne?
So I would say two things. I'd say, first of all, I do think it's a mistake to think that the primary political contest in this country is between Trump and the media. The primary political contest is between Trump and his political opponents. And it is not the role of the media to win the next election. It is the role of the Democratic Congress and Democratic candidates to win the next election. Of course, the media plays a role in that, but I think thinking of the media as the political opposition does no favors to the media, and it actually helps Trump in his narrative, because that's what he's trying to say. He's trying to build up the media as the enemy so that it becomes disqualified and undermined,
Oh, he's been
and
successful
so that
at
it
it.
becomes the main opponent instead of Nancy Pelosi, who's more important than the media, frankly, as a she's the Speaker of the House. So that's the first point. The second point is, I can just tell you what I do, which is that I've written this, I've argued that the best thing we can do, and this is true in the case of Trump, and it's true in the case of the populist parties that I write about elsewhere in the world, is to change the subject. Who gets to decide what the most important news of the day is? Is it Trump and his Twitter feed, or is it us? Is it who gets to say? And the best thing you can do, for example, I argued in the case of the caravan during the election campaign. Don't write about the bloody caravan. The caravan doesn't exist. It's not important. Stop talking about it. Focus on issues, electoral issues that people care about. People care about jobs. They care about health care. It's an election. Talk about that, not about a fictitious story.
Jeff?
Real
last word.
quickly, before I quoted Kellyanne Conway, now I'm going to quote Spiro Agnew, so I don't know what's wrong with me. But we do have a silent majority in this country now. But the media coverage goes to the base, the base, the base. We worry about what the base is doing. What's the base thinking? We're not covering the majority of the people who voted otherwise. So I'm going to disagree with you. Thank you for the shout-outs. But I don't think we need to go to war. I think we have to do the opposite, which is to preserve and bring peace. I recently redefined journalism because I have tenure and I can do obnoxious things like that. And my new definition is to convene communities into civil, informed, and productive conversation. And I think that we have to see our job is to build bridges, is to make strangers less strange, is to stop the demonization of the other, is to cover the issues that matter in people's lives, and not let Trump declare war, not let him set the agenda, and do a better job of listening to the majority of this country and their lives.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we do not have any more time for questions, but on that note, I want to thank Graciela, Michelle, and Jeff, and thank all of you.